Welcome. We are back from spring break and into our next week of OOTLE15, the Open Old Testament Learning Event 2015. This Google Hangout on Air is the conclusion of our time with the Deuteronomistic history, or the historical books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And we'll be starting up with the Pentateuch next time around, starting next week. So probably just be me today. And so what I'd like to do this time is to invite, we might keep it a little bit short, but I would like for participants to have a chance to weigh in on ideas around that you all want to knock around. And what I'd said we would be able to spend some time on today is royal theology, which might not be that sexy and exciting, but I mean, there's a lot of really interesting things around the royal theology, but one that was on my mind this week, and I honestly don't know whether I talk about it in my lecture or not, is the way into talking about myth in the Hebrew Bible, myth in the Old Testament, and especially as a way into myth that's not the creation stories of the book of Genesis. What is myth? Is it okay if parts of the Bible are myth? Even by myth, is myth simply everything that didn't happen? Like things that does it just mean false, or a larger idea about myth as stories that have some explanatory power or descriptive power about how we see ourselves in relation to the transcendent, and that have that sort of narrative explanatory power. So that's one possibility, and I'd like people to have a chance to weigh in on that and ask questions. So by all means, those of you that are on Twitter, if you've got questions around that, or comments, or things that you'd like to touch on, or feelers you want to put out there about things that might be interesting to address there, by all means do it. And let's plan on doing that first. While you're doing that, I'll give you a heads up, or I'll follow through on the other things that we could address today. One of those is anti-Judaism, and where that anti-Judaism and Christian reading of the Hebrew Bible. This is a big one for me because it's a big part of the formation that I had when I was a math, doing Introduction to the New Testament, Introduction to Old Testament, and Introduction to Theology. All of my instructors were sort of collaborating with one another in a discussion around issues of especially the post-Shoah or post-Holocaust, largely but not exclusively Protestant conversations around Christian culpability for Holocaust in terms of in the wake of 2,000 years of teaching of contempt for Judaism. And this comes up for me in a particular way when we're doing the Deuteronomistic history, because that's the point where it's most natural, and I emphasize that it's natural, most natural for learners to you start hearing the language of the Old Testament versus the New Testament, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, all that kind of stuff. And it's not just in seminary. Done anything in your churches or in any churches with adult ed around biblical passages, if you ever do anything with the Old Testament, things about, oh, the Old Testament God is so mean and wrathful and awful and threatening, and the New Testament God is so wonderful and brings everyone out for an ice cream cone, and we sort of, I mean, when we think about it, we know that there are some critical tools or some challenges to bring to what sounds at what begins to become a parent dichotomy, right, and one that raises questions of its own. So that's we can go at that as a second thing today. So royal theology, anti-Judaism in the Christian reading of the Hebrew Bible, and then finally also Ferguson's syllabus. And I mean, this came up for me personally in that it was, literally in our first 3 days of spring break, Maundy, Thursday, and Holy Saturday, that Walter Scott and Eric Harris were both shot and killed by police. And, before that, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, so on and so on. Our institution, and not everyone will know this, at our institution, there is, at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, among faculty, it's hard to say how much this translates into involvement of students, which, is a problem, if or potentially a problem. But there's a tremendous amount of, at least certainly, faculty energy and administrative energy around that the institution is not silent on systemic racism, and particularly in this year, 2014, 2015, around issues of heavily militarized police response to black protest over the killings of unarmed black men by usually white agents of the state's executive branch. So, and as I don't know if I mentioned this in the preparation materials or in the materials for this week, but that for me anyway, what can seem like a daunting task of, okay, what does Introduction to the Old Testament have to do with Ferguson, race and racism, state violence against black bodies? There can feel like a huge gulf between these. Like, how do we bring one into conversation with the other? And I think as an impulse, I sort of like the idea of returning to the big ideas and essential questions that at least I have raised as being sort of what animates my interest in Introduction to the Old Testament. Issues around as, are all histories narrative fiction? Not all prophets are saying the same things as one another. Biblical texts disagree with one another on the nature of God and what God wants. The Bible is comfortable holding God accountable for injustice. That these provide, maybe I guess I would say, of abstraction that can serve as a bridge between a very specific subject matter and a very specific, urgent, contemporary theological concern. While I'm doing all this talking, I'm not looking closely at Twitter because, of course, I'm talking. Okay, so OT Jonah says, pet peeve in conversations about scripture, the assumption that myth equals lie and fact equals truth. Melissa Gull 12 says, oh no, my computer jumped as he was saying, let's do that first. What I was saying is we've got royal theology, and I guess especially, as a focus, myth in the Hebrew Bible, and royal theology as an avenue into myth. Second topic, anti-Judaism in Christian reading of the Hebrew scriptures, and especially the Deuteronomistic theology as the kind of material that really kind of provokes that sort of response on the part of Christians of, oh, the Old Testament God is so this, the ABC, but the New Testament God is so XYZ. And the third topic being Ferguson syllabus. I think we can do all three, but maybe not give each of them equal weight. We should put our time where we want it to go. Myth equals lie and fact equals truth, right? That's the issue around myth. And so we're looking, aren't we, for an understanding of myth that, Bigfoot, fact or myth? This kind, there's sort of an analogy to the way theory is used. Evolution is just a theory. Well, yeah, that's why theory has more than one entry in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, isn't it, right? It has a kind of general colloquial use of just sort of an idea of things, and a very specific disciplinary use in science, referring to something very different and something a good deal more sort of certain and complex. something something that is already demonstrated to have enormous explanatory power, right, as a theory. And same thing with myth, right? Myth has this colloquial thing of, anything that's not true. If it's a lie, it's a myth. Whereas in this technical use, right, this literary use, a myth being a story that, or a story, I guess you could say a story or a narrative that has this explanatory power, that says something about humans' relationship to the divine. And I think it becomes more clear when you look at specific examples, and I'd like to do that. J.L. Brash 91 says, can we talk more about the historical setting of royal theology? I feel confused. About it as there's these two huge events, aren't there, right? The fall of the northern kingdom to the Assyrians in 722, the fall of the southern kingdom to the Babylonians in 587, yeah? And after the first one, Judah alone, and obviously there's something to be explained. The Assyrians have destroyed the northern kingdom. How is that going to be explained theologically? This is obviously the time when one move going on here is to preserve some of the prophets, like Hosea, right? Like Amos, like Isaiah, who have said who have explained the coming of the Assyrians in terms of God's punishment for the people Israel, for the first two, especially for the northern kingdom Israel. And the rest, and of course, the other part that needs to be explained is why not the southern kingdom, right? The Assyrians came against Jerusalem too in 701. They had to walk away empty-handed. Historically, part of the reason they walked away is that Jerusalem capitulated and paid tribute, right? So they didn't have to breach the wall of Jerusalem. But the point being is that, right, Jerusalem didn't fall. So part of what is brought as an explanation there, yeah, is that, all along, Judah has thought that its state religion, its Yahweh state religion, was correct in ways that the northern state religion was not. Our state religion is centered around Jerusalem rather than around Bethel and Dan. Our state religion sort of revolves around God's promises to David and God's promises to Jerusalem. God makes assurances to a dynastic house and to a city. The northern state religion apparently, it's arguable, because we see this only through the lens of the polemic of the southern kingdom, which is against the northern kingdom, but seems to be more around Moses, and Moses as the one who led the Exodus, and the Exodus as showing God's special love for the people Israel, right? Brought them out of bondage. This is brought you out of the land of Egypt, that house of slaves. So in this context, there's the idea is that there's this renewed interest and this renewed assurance about God has chosen a house, a dynastic house, and a city. And where myth comes in to this, someone tell me in the Twitter feed, if you would, some perspicacious student who has seen the lecture on royal theology, whether I talk about myth in there. I think I do, and if I did, I won't totally rehash the whole thing here. So I'll be watching for that in the Twitter feed. But the idea being, right, that in 2 Samuel 7, and especially in the royal Psalms, think of the Psalms, Messianic Psalms, Psalm 2, Psalm 110, Psalm 70 something, 8 or 9, I'm not sure, Psalm 89 verses 1 through 37 especially, that God's choice of David, right? I mean, historically, God chose Saul, and then God chose David, but the royal theology says that choice is not the same. God's choice of Saul is described narratively as very contingent. If you are obedient, if you do thus and so. But as soon as Saul falls out of famous, the throne is taken away not only from him, but from his descendants. They're just out of the picture. Whereas the promises made to David are relatively unconditional. There must always be a Stark and Winterfell. There will always be a Davidic king on the throne. When they disobey, they'll be punished, but the throne will not be taken away from them. And this And this choice of Jerusalem, especially in these royal psalms, is strongly linked to creation language. Why creation language? I'm arguing that God's choice of David and Jerusalem presented in the royal theology as being not something that just happens around the year 1000 BCE or so, and then maybe even then is everlasting, right? This isn't just something that happens in a certain year on the calendar and then is everlasting, but that this choice is already made in the creation of the world. God's choice of David and Jerusalem, while not manifest until a certain year in history, are part of the fabric of the universe. And this is why, Psalm 89 represents the Davidic king as holding his hand over the sea. Thank you, Tanya Dozeman, very much. Yeah, so this is, right, so I go on this longer in the lecture, but you get that idea. It's okay if you haven't looked at the lecture yet, right? Because it's okay if you don't do it. I know not all of you will have gotten to it yet. And so what makes it myth is, there's what's happening in the worldly level, and there's what's happening in eternity. And that these are related and connected. We've already done apocalyptic. Think about how this is going to play out later in a different way, but analogous in apocalyptic, where the things when God reveals through a messenger, to the human recipient what is playing out at the divine level in the book of Daniel, right? A battle between Michael and the divine prince of Persia or the divine prince of Greece. These battles that are going between the representative of the people Israel and the representatives of the Persians and the Greek reflect and anticipate what's happening in the worldly level. Take that back to this period, hundreds of years earlier, but there's still that idea that there's the worldly and there's the eternal, which is happening behind the worldly, and these are linked. And God's choice of the Davidic king and of Jerusalem not manifest in the earthly realm until a certain year, but from in eternity, always and already a part of, I guess, what we would call space-time. Why? So why are we talking about it? There is in biblical, something you would want to know about in biblical studies, and this is going to play into the anti-Judaism stuff as well, because everything is connected, is there's this period in biblical studies, everyone is finding that, like, oh, here's how Israel is different from its neighbors. All of its neighbors had myth. Canaanites had myth. Myth happens in cycles. The Baal cycle, right, for example, right, that there's, Baal is an agricultural god whose story of living and then dying and going into the underground to the world of moat, or to the world of death, or being defeated by sea, the forces of chaos, and being buried on. Sister has to go look for him. Think of like Persephone in Greece, and then emerges from the grave to rule again. So the argument at this time being that Canaanites have myth, and myth is all about agricultural cycles, and these poor Canaanites have no concept of history because they're trapped by this cyclical conception of the world as myth, whereas the Israelites have history. They have the Exodus, which happened at this point on the calendar. You're not sure when, but it was like a certain number of generations ago. And then there were these generations, and then, from Moses to, whatever the present is. The Israelites had this conception of time as linear and historical. And this is what places the Israelites at an evolutionary leap ahead in terms of their religious outlook over the Canaanites. It's a very big idea in religious studies and in biblical studies. partly broken through by folks like Frank Moore Cross, who wrote a book called Canaanite Myth and Hebrew Epic, who argued that, you know, for him, epic was the joining of a historical worldview and a mythic worldview, arguing that the Canaanites, in fact, had both, and the Israelites, in fact, had both. And so then obviously the question comes up, where is there myth in the Hebrew Bible, right? You know, and so where will you show that the Israelites had a mythic worldview as well as a historical worldview? Royal theology is an example, and I like it as an example to hit before Genesis, because in our culture, and in our culture that is incredibly polarized around issues, and where even learners who do not have, you know, any ideological eggs in the basket of a young earth or creationism, you know, we'll often have a sort of walk around cultural idea that, well, if the Bible happened, and or at least we should think that it happened, or we should say that it happened if we're going to be good Christians or good readers of the, or be biblical. And so myth and Genesis is a lightning rod. So I like to start it with the royal theology, first. Any evidence that characters such as Saul, David, and Solomon were historical characters or legends or both? The issues around, I mean, there's a lot of confidence that these folks existed, except you always isolate the group of scholars that are sometimes called the minimalists, or the Copenhagen school. And Davies, Thompson, Lemke, others, who will often argue effectively that, and it's a little more nuanced than this, that most of the Hebrew Bible is certainly post-exilic, and much of it Hellenistic, that is after in about 332 BCE, and that the Hebrew Bible, that the Persians sent a bunch of people to Judah to take control of the, you know, to rebuild the temple and to assert control over the district of Judea, but that there is no necessary connection between these folks and the folks who were deported out of there in the, and so that biblical claims about this long history before the exile and the connection returnees to that pre-exilic history, the minimalists are basically arguing that this is a narrative, this connection and much of this history is a narrative fiction that justifies the authority, this post-exilic temple crowd over the district of Judea. So they will tend to see Saul, David, Solomon as pretty much made up. If you get a chance, I don't think that this is I don't think this is an open access article, but Baruch Halpern wrote, Halpern, Halpern wrote an article called, I think, The Minimalist Assault on Ancient Israel. Maybe that was the subtitle. It was in Biblical Archaeology Review. And one nice thing about the article is it tells you a huge amount about the minimalists. And it also, and this is why I bring it, especially why I bring it up, is that it has a nice table in there that shows what is the literary, epigraphic, inscriptional evidence for the pre-exilic biblical history. So guys like, you know, where do the Assyrians or the Babylonians talk about kings like Omri or kings like Jehu? How early do they start talking about ancient Israelite kings, and who do they talk about? One controversial inscription includes the phrase, tell something like the phrase, David. If read that way, it would be the house of David, right? So that would be inscriptional evidence for David. Not everybody reads it that way, yeah. Most of the rest of biblical scholarship outside of that group will argue that, you know, we can have a certain amount of confidence about Saul, David, and Solomon being historical figures. The real question is, what did they really do, and what were their lives really like? So, for example, was David ever much more than the captain of a platoon of brigands who something like a control over tribal league. Did Solomon create the impressive monumental architecture that is associated with him in the Bible, like the gates at and Gezer? Because doing that kind of monumental architecture, the same architecture at 3 disparate sites, would imply a pretty well-controlled and well-organized state. If Solomon did not, it belongs to the generation after him and was only later attributed to him. You know, some will argue that, and they'll have evidence why they see it that way. So that's kind of where that stuff falls out. How do we vote for our favorite moments? What do you mean moments? What did I miss? JL Brash 91. Tell me more about that if that's something that you want me to answer. Do you just mean the 3 things that we're talking about today? And here at the halfway point, we've talked about one. How about anti-Judaism? Since I see Tanya Dozeman asking, if the NT God is ice cream, how do you get people to understand the different flavor? Right, Tanya hacks upon my statement before that you know, the Old Testament God is a big meanie, and the New Testament God takes everybody out for ice cream. And so you ask, you know, how do we understand the Hebrew Bible as a different flavor? Maybe there's also ice cream in the Old Testament. I used to do an exercise with my face-to-face classes, and I have not yet done it with one of my online classes. Maybe I should have done it with you all. You can tell me whether I should have done it with you all. Nothing stops you from doing it yourself if you choose. We do an exercise, what is the gospel, with the follow-up in order to get to the question of, is the gospel in the Hebrew Bible? And the setup for this would be the many ways that the New Testament talks about the gospel. A lot of people say, you know, what is the gospel? Oh, the gospel is, you know, Christ, who is something, right? Like the second person in a Trinity, or some other understanding, is resurrected. And then maybe filling in on that, something about Christ's ministry, maybe some things about the implications of that resurrection, atonement, or what have you. But that the gospel story will normally be associated with the narrative of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But then, boom, you go look at, thank you, Shar, for the Baruch Halpern citation. Gospel in the New Testament, well, for example, Jesus comes in Mark, right? The biggest secret throughout the narrative of Mark is that Jesus is the Messiah, and that he's going to suffer and die and be raised. And so, and yet Jesus comes out of the desert at the beginning of his ministry after the death of John the Baptist, preaching the gospel, right? And so he's preaching the gospel, and that gospel is not his own life, death, and resurrection, but has more to do with, you know, the kingdom of God having come near, something maybe related to John the Baptist's message of repentance. The question of what the gospel is a complicated one. And when I was doing my own master's work, my instructors at Christian Theological Seminary, this was mainly Ron Allen in New Testament and Charles Allen, no relation, in theology, but also others. Clark Williamson, who was teaching at that time, but I just didn't have him, were facilitating a conversation with their students about what is the gospel, and a kind of Swiss Army knife gospel that we were sort of hacking on together was God loves all persons unconditionally, and God demands of every person that they embody that love for all the world. God loves all persons unconditionally. God demands that we embody that love for all the world. And then students would hack on it according to their own traditions and understandings or thinkings about whether it is all persons or not all persons, and unconditional in what ways, and are there any conditions in an unconditional invitation to love? And then what does it mean to embody that love for all the world? And do we embody that love for all the world or part of the world? And, so I would, so this would lead to an invitation for students to ask the question of, if you can hack that minimum kit gospel into something that you can live with. That is, if you can get to it as a if you are a Christian, and if the gospel for you is mainly wrapped up in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, if you are able to articulate that as a gospel that is revealed in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, rather than the gospel simply being the narrative of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, then you can say, okay, if this is a gospel that is revealed in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, is it also revealed in the Hebrew Bible? Is it revealed fully in the Hebrew Bible or only partially in the Hebrew Bible? How would you know where it's, how do you decide where it is in the Hebrew Bible? And so this is the conversation that we would have at that time and place, and that I've had with some of my classes of students around the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, and to sort of go at what are often some very implicit and unrecognized presuppositions that, oh, of course the Old Testament is sort of a negative gospel that shows the need for the gospel. And so this exercise becomes a way of sort of addressing that. But I'm curious, and if I'd had guests here today, I was very anxious to ask them what their own experience is as educators with this business of, oh, the God of the Old Testament, oh, the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament is wrath and meanness and law, and the God of the New Testament is happiness and ice cream and grace. Does that mean that there is not grace in the Hebrew Bible? What would count as grace in the Hebrew Bible? So I guess my question for learners would be, and maybe some of you can chime in on this on Twitter, is this also your experience? That is, I don't want to assume what your own background's with on this business of the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. That is, I don't want to be like sort of teaching on something that maybe isn't an issue for a lot of folks. It is, or maybe not in ways that I would be prepared to recognize, but you are. So that's where my interest is around that. But I think we can all sort of count on that one of the things we're going to be contended, we biblical scholars, I'm looking at you OOTLE15 students, because that's you now, we biblical scholars, I've had it already this week more than once. Oh my gosh, go on Facebook sometime if you've got a lot of churchy folks in your Facebook. But just yesterday and the day before, I found myself involved in a comment thread on Facebook where the poster, the status update person, posed a question that was really a super interesting question about whether God is, the way I read the question is God immutable in the sort of Greek unchanging perfect God way, or is God mutable in the sense of God changes in response to humans, humanity, the historical conditions of humans? Does God change? Does God change? But the way that the question was phrased right at the outset was in terms of that presupposing that something happens in Jesus Christ to change God from being the God of the Old Testament to the God of the New Testament. And for me, that was a huge sort of derail or detour, but around that sort of distracted from the question. But for the person asking the question, that was very much, it was a presupposition. So of course it was at the center of what they were asking. Yeah, the question of what is grace in the Hebrew Bible and where is grace in the Hebrew Bible? You see this, anti-K15 echoes the question and raises it about what is grace in the Hebrew Bible. You'll see this, folks, especially in a lot of the German scholarship, not surprisingly, or where even more urgency than the worldwide Protestant churches, who have to be asking how has our 2,000 years of Christian teaching of contempt for Judaism led to Shoah, led to Holocaust? The German church having to ask in an especially urgent way, how has 2,000 years of teaching of contempt, Christian teaching of contempt for Judaism, led to our direct participation? And so, for example, I was struck when I was teaching a number of years using Rolf Rentdorf's textbook as an introductory text. And Rentdorf, I'm trying to remember this even as I say it, Rentdorf had a lot to say about the narrative shape, hey, of the Pentateuch, right, which is coming up next week, about the narrative shape of the Pentateuch around the Sinai narrative, where the law is given, the law is given on Sinai, and the law is only given after God has delivered the Hebrews from Egypt in an act of grace. There is nothing that the Hebrews had to do to earn their way out of Egypt. There was not some formula they had to pray correctly, like a Deuteronomistic prayer or anything. God was not stamping out slavery worldwide, and with the Hebrews just going along for the ride because slavery is part of the law. But the giving of the law of Sinai sits, and the covenant made, the Mosaic covenant made with the people at Sinai, rests upon the bedrock of God's gracious deliverance of the people Israel from slavery in Egypt. You're going to hear me about this, folks, in the lectures, in the lecture called Covenant, which I think will be it's the first, or this, it's the second lecture that you'll have in the Pentateuch unit. So that would be an example, and that struck me because Rentdorf was writing as a German post-Holocaust biblical scholar, and where you saw that was he's attributing the shape of the Pentateuch in that respect to the priestly writer. The priestly writer, you're going to hear about this more as we get into the Pentateuch, had traditionally been considered like the least theologically adequate of the four Pentateuchal sources, JEDP, described previously in Christian scholarship. The priestly writer is described as like the dead fossilized husk of religion, because the priestly writer cares about calendars, and the Protestant biblical scholars thought that calendars and rituals were kind of stupid, and it's everything's supposed to be spontaneous worship, yeah. And so the priestly writer had this really horrible rap, and what these early Protestant scholars were not able to see for themselves is that for them, they were conflating against ritual religion, including Judaism, even Roman Catholicism, that they were sort of piling all of that prejudice upon the priestly writer and creating a feedback loop to where they would pile those prejudices upon the priestly writer, and then everything that they didn't like about the priestly writer reinforced their prejudices about Judaism, and it's in this post-Holocaust, post-Shoah German scholarship, as represented in my anecdote here by Rentdorf. You see a real intentionality to rehabilitate the priestly writer. Right? It is incredibly it is hard to describe how striking it is that Rentdorf is ascribing to the priestly writer the narrative shape of the Pentateuch that grounds the Mosaic covenant of obedience and stipulations upon the gracious, unearned, unmerited election of the Israelites in the Exodus. Okay. So more of that coming in the Pentateuch. Great. As an example of grace in the not only in the Hebrew Bible, in the Pentateuch, and not only in the Pentateuch, but in the priestly writer. Lots of good stuff coming from your TA here. Resources around a lot of these issues. What about the evolution of our understanding of God? Yeah, Tanya Dozeman, what about it? I mean, an evolution of the understanding of God between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, and I'll get off this topic because I know we'll want to do some Ferguson syllabus before we get out of here. One or two folks expressed some energy about it early on. The only thing that makes me a tiny bit nervous about Tanya Dozeman's The Evolution of the Understanding of God, and it's got nothing to do with you, what I'm nervous about is pay attention to this as you start in the Pentateuch, and you have a lecture from me on Julius Wellhausen. And remember I said that Wellhausen and a lot of these others had a really negative view of the priestly writer. And briefly, super briefly, you'll hear more about this in the lecture, that narrative is something like the J writer and to a certain extent the E writer are both super Protestant understanding of God, because everything is all about agricultural calendars, which are very loosey-goosey, and the spontaneous animal sacrifice as a spontaneous act of gratitude to God, and so on. And that goes to the Deuteronomistic sort of organize things, like with centralizing worship in Jerusalem and so on. And for Wellhausen, that's sounding some alarms. And then by the time you get to the priestly writer who says, no, not an agricultural calendar, we will have a calendar so we actually know when things are going to happen. And we will have a fixed priestly class of those who are derived from Aaron are above those who are derived from the Levites and from Moses. This is where Wellhausen is going to, and this is like almost a quote from him on the priestly writer, the dead fossilized husk of Israelite religion. And for Wellhausen, this is it's a devolutionary move. It's an evolutionary move because the Deuteronomists really love the prophets, and that's a move up. Wellhausen loves the prophets because the prophets are kind of like proto-Christians, and especially for Christian folk who see the prophets as pointing to Christ. So you have this movement where like you have J and E who are like on their way up to something good because they're way better than the Canaanites. Remember before about myth and history, right? So you have the Canaanites who are wrapped up in their myth cycles, poor them. And then the J and E writers who are moving us into a historical understanding of the world, and that's good. And then you have the D writers who have some things that aren't great about them, but the prophets, they're really showing us, they're really showing the prophets for us and affirming the prophets. And that's almost Christianity by gum. And then the priestly writer is like, just like this chasm, this drop. And for Wellhausen, we have to kind of like ignore the priestly writer and like jump over the priestly writer into the book of Matthew and grace and ice cream cones and so on. So that's what makes me nervous about when we talk about the evolution of our understanding of God, but in a more kind of mundane, lowercase e idea that what about evolution implies that evolution should not is getting better all the time, because that's not what evolution means. Evolution simply means that things are changing all the time. Some of them more fit for certain environments than for others, and so some changes stick, but there's not like an escalating upward movement in evolution. But that's the way we usually think about evolution. But if we think about evolution in maybe the strict sense or the truer sense of changing all the time things of God, and those changing understandings that are represented in a pluriform way, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. What I would really urge learners to do is if you've already had introduction to New Testament, really go back and look at it and say, is it really all ice cream cones with this God who divides between the sheep and the goats, and the Jesus who's up to his fetlocks and blood in the book of Revelation, who comes to bring not peace but a sword, the God who's pretty blithe, Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts. Like, I mean, yeah, it's not genocide, but I mean, is that what makes the difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament is just that the body count is lower? Does that translate to ice cream cones? Anyway, so on and so on. Then I hope you look forward to an introduction to New Testament class where you can ask yourself, like, having looked at the Old Testament enough to see like grace where maybe you didn't see it before, then can you look at the New Testament in a way that says maybe it's not all ice cream cones after all, and maybe these testaments end up something on more like a level playing field than maybe some folks might have anticipated. D. Harold Garrett, I see you saying Old Testament scriptures are in the lectionary. Many preachers still chose not to preach them. A lot of folks get really squirrely and antsy about how much The Easter season readings are Stephen and Peter in the book of Acts talking about you Israelites who killed the author of life, and so on and so on. For fear of the Jews. It's just like, oh my God. And reminding, you know, even if you're in a lectionary based church, I mean, I do think these texts make you have to ask yourself, are we going to read them? And if we're going to read them, we have to say something about them, right? We can read something else, but if we are going to read these texts, we have to say something about it and not simply let those texts speak for themselves. Folks, I've given you an assignment, and it was rather spur of the moment, the Ferguson syllabus assignment for this week, again in direct response to things that were happening during what, for us at least at Garrett Evangelical, is a spring break. And I've intentionally, and I know this can be really squirrely because it's not always what you're used to as learners, I've left that as a very open-ended activity. I don't know what's going to happen to it in that assignment, to the extent that as long as everyone treats one another with respect, and is patient with one another and giving themselves some rooms to, like, it's to talk about race, because everyone, where's my book? There's the book that we all read, there's the book that all students were invited to read for orientation this year at Garrett Evangelical, and it was Whistling Vivaldi. And Whistling Vivaldi by Claude M. Steele, we were invited to read it for orientation. We talked about it at orientation and a little bit since. And my point in bringing it up here is that Claude M. Steele makes the case that there's such a thing as stereotype. Oh, I'm going to get the phrase wrong, the gun, and I'm not looking it up. Stereotype. Somebody help me. That thing that happens, it's not stereotype anxiety. It's that thing that happens when you are anxious because the thing you do or the thing you say may reinforce stereotypes about your group, right? And what is certainly the case in student conversations about race and racism and systemic racism is many folks, whether students of color, Black students, Hispanic students, Asian students, will all share in their own ways some of that anxiety that the things that we bring to that conversation may be thought to reinforce stereotypes about us. The way white students will sometimes describe it is, you know, even there's that shows their ignorance about race, and that reinforces stereotypes about them as not being interested in race because of the privilege that they enjoy that allows them not to care. Things like this. So, I mean, my point here is a long way around to saying, as long as folks are all sort of being really gentle, really good with one another, and giving one another the benefit of a doubt while still having the courage to sort of speak truth, I actually don't, that's what it means. I actually don't care what happens, because this is really one of those ones where what matters to me as an educator and as the facilitator of a learning space is that we commit to giving it a try. We commit to a conversation that asks the very simple stereotype threat. Thank you, JL Brash 91. I could go off and come up with what seemed to me to be very reasonable connections between the subject matter of the Hebrew Bible and urgent, pressing, contemporary theological concerns, racism in the US, and particularly state violence against Black bodies. You know, the conversation around hashtag Black Lives Matter. Right? Not saying that all lives don't matter, not saying that also there are these other issues. I mean, for instance, police violence, militarized and other strong police violence against, for example, the mentally ill is a huge issue at the same time. But to be able to say we're going to focus this conversation in this particular way hashtag Black Lives Matter and say, these other conversations are important. We're not going to forget about them, but we can't have all the conversations at once. Let's have this one right for this moment. And so I could go off and make the connections between the Black Lives Matter, Ferguson syllabus conversation and Introduction to Old Testament, but I'd really rather create the conditions for a conversation where, as learners who are participating in OOTLE15, we give it a shot on our own to throw our ideas out there. And then we can all do so. I can do something with those ideas. You can follow through on those ideas. And perhaps in OOTLE16 or in some of the advanced level courses that I or others that you might participate in, or maybe you will be entering other courses in your curriculum here and be bringing and saying, hey, can we have this conversation? And I have some ideas about how that might happen. We can all make our own decisions about what we do with this stuff as we go forward. I don't know if people know about Ferguson. Do people know about Ferguson syllabus? As a regular Twitter user, I kind of feel like I don't know if I can get any feedback from y'all on Twitter on whether this Ferguson syllabus is a thing that you are already in conversation with. I know I introduced it to you in the week 10 program of activities. I think that's all I have to say right offhand about Ferguson syllabus and Introduction to the Old Testament, is just that I hope we can do something with that. Just a Google Doc, right? Just get down on a Google Doc and do some stuff there and see what happens. And again, I tend to think that the big ideas and essential questions that at least I've offered for the course, and you may have your own, right, might offer a sort of bridge of abstraction between this detailed thing about the subject matter of the Hebrew Bible and this detailed thing about Ferguson syllabus as a pressing theological and cultural concern in the United States in their first quarter of the 21st century. Guys, this is the second time I've done this thing solo, and I never think it's going to go. I'll probably feel like I want to sleep for a week, but I really appreciate you all being active participants here in the Twitter feed and helping me have an idea of where to go and what's triggering your attention and what's not. Anybody want to throw anything on the Twitter feed before we wrap things up? Go ahead and do that. And while you're throwing up any last thoughts or points of interest or anything you want addressed on the Twitter feed, I'll remind folks that this is Google Biblical Scholar Hangouts on Air. It's usually me with some guests. A couple of times now it's been just me. And this is in service to the course OOTLE15, the Open Old Testament Learning Event 2015, which you can find at OOTLE15.net. Let's see, I haven't said who I am. I'm Brooke Lester. I'm at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, Director of Digital Learning and Assistant Professor in Hebrew Scriptures. And I'm seeing a couple of folks, this is something that is new to them. I do encourage you to simply, if I know you all know how to follow a hashtag on Twitter because you're doing it now. You're following the OOTLE15 hashtag on Twitter. Skills to look at the Ferguson syllabus, right? All one word, Ferguson syllabus hashtag on Twitter. You know how you have the option between top posts and all posts? So choose one or the other. I always click all. And just work your way back through it. There's a lot of to see folks, and this is what really interests me about it, folks across all disciplines. This isn't just a biblical scholar thing. It is a nationwide, and more than nationwide, international, largely higher education, but also K through 12 endeavor to explore ways of making the questions around the events of Michael Brown's shooting, and then of course the other similar cases, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Eric Harris, Walter Scott, so on and so on, LeVar Jones, I think, how how these questions can gain traction by really just that. How can this I mean, just you can't talk about things like silver linings or anything, but how can not just the awful things happen, right? So yeah, thank you all for a great hangout. And next week we will be into the Pentateuch, and that means I'm pretty sure we're going to see Nisha Jr. here, who has been terrifically patient waiting for us to get to the Pentateuch, and we'll see who else is here. Welcome back from spring break, everyone. I hope you are somewhat refreshed and restored, and we will pick this up again next week. Everybody, thanks for your continuing work in the course, and goodbye.